Welcome back. We talk here generally and in news coverage pretty frequently about the Fed Reserve, describing it accurately as a huge lever in the U.S. economy. Today's hint toward a September rate cut, as we discussed earlier in the show, propelled stocks upward, meant tens of billions of dollars in wealth generation because of something that was said, not because of something that was done. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not how it used to be. To explore that and other dimensions of American economic history and why, incidentally, we are so economically discontented, we turned here to Jonathan Levy, author of The Ages of American Capitalism. Here is part of my conversation with Jonathan. There's a good portion of my audience, Jonathan, that doesn't know a time in America where the Federal Reserve was not a constant part of even a generalist's conversation about what was happening in the U.S. economy. It wasn't always so. Explain to my audience when that got started.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Major. I think that got started in the early 1980s, the kind of modern era in which the central bank, the Federal Reserve, plays such an important role in shaping the American economy. Began in 1979 when a new chairman of the Federal Reserve was appointed by Jimmy Carter, Paul Volcker. At the time, there was very high inflation in the United States. The value of the dollar had plummeted, and Volcker raised interest rates, both to tamp down inflation and to restore the value of the dollar. That induced a strong recession, a lot of unemployment. It lasted until 1982. It coincided with the reduction of inflation. At that point, Volcker relented and reduced interest rates, and a new expansion began across the 1980s. And really, ever since then, the Federal Reserve has been the most important, I think, government institution with respect to the regulation of and the driving of and the shaping of capitalism in the United States.
And how did that capitalism change in that era that you describe as the age of chaos?
Well, I call the age of chaos one that began in 1982. The age before it, I call the age of control. That's a post-war period, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's an era that was still, to a large degree, dominated by an industrial economy. Deindustrialization had already begun in the 1960s and 1970s, but industry was still, in many respects, the backbone of the American economy. From the 1980s forward, ever since then, finance and services become much more important to the American economy, which is precisely why the Fed, in charge of monetary policy, plays such a prominent role, has played and continues to play such a prominent role in the United States economy.
There's a sentence that jumps out in your discussing this age of chaos: a capitalism dominated by asset price appreciation. For the generalist in my audience, help them understand what that means and why it's so important.
Okay, I think in the era before, when you have an industrial economy, you grow the economy by using capital. Think of a factory. You use it up, and as you use that factory, you combine it with labor to produce goods. The value of the capital depreciates, right? If you're using a factory, you start in January, and you run the factory, by the end of the year, it's worth less, but you produced goods in combination with labor. In a financialized economy, capital appreciates. So think about a stock, right, or a bond, right? You want the price or the value of capital to go up. But in order to do that, what you need is debt, right? The more debt you have, the more you can juice financial profits. But you don't need a lot of labor, right, to create value that way. And so you end up with an economy that increases inequality, but not just inequality, it really excludes a lot of people from valuation in the economy. That way that's taken place largely in the United States over the last 40 years has been geographical disparities. And so in regions of the country, they're rather obvious, we could say them, places like New York, places like Silicon Valley, see a lot of asset price appreciation, both in financial instruments, but also in homes. Homes is another asset, real estate, but it does so in a way that largely excludes labor from earning a share of the value created.
And that exclusion of labor creates frustration. And if I'm listening to you correctly and reading your book correctly, part or a large part of the political frustration in our American experience now can be traced to this age of chaos and things that have either silently or unobservedly flowed through to create this separation economically and the underlying frustration?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, it creates frustration in politics, but it also creates social pathologies, isolation, destruction of communities that then feeds into politics in insidious ways. And it's been a slow build. It's been a slow boil over the last 40 years. But I think it's fair to say here, I think 2008 would be a crucial kind of marker. But in many respects, the kind of inequities and exclusions of that capitalism that we've lived with for the last 40 years is not exclusively responsible, but I think to a large degree, as you say, is very much responsible for political frustrations in the United States today.
You can catch my full interview with Jonathan Levy on your favorite podcast platform.